You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to the 465th episode of our Civil War podcast. My name is Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all, welcome to the podcast.
To start off this episode, we're going to take you back to a moment when, in the cold, early darkness of March 2nd, 1864, a federal officer lay dying in the middle of a muddy road near Stevensville, Virginia. He was 21-year-old Colonel Ulrich Dahlgren, and documents later found on his body would set off a public and political firestorm in both the Union and the Confederacy.
Dahlgren was killed there northeast of the Confederate capital of Richmond in the early spring of 1864 during a bold raid conceived by Union Cavalry General Judson Kilpatrick. What became known as the Kilpatrick-Dahlgren raid would merely be an interesting footnote in Civil War history if it wasn't for those papers that were found on Ulrich Dahlgren's body.
But rather than simply being remembered as a bold plan that went awry, the Kilpatrick-Dahlgren raid, because of those documents, instead generated one of the most enduring controversies of the Civil War. With this little story arc, we'll talk about the story of the raid itself, and then we'll discuss the controversy that erupted in its aftermath.
We've met Judson Kilpatrick before on the podcast and noted that during the Civil War he would earn the rather unflattering nickname Kill Cavalry for the way he used up men and horses. In February 1864, Kilpatrick was 28 years old, a brigadier general and commander of a cavalry division in the Army of the Potomac. He was also a man of boundless ambition.
He was born in Deckertown, New Jersey in January 1836, the second son of Simon and Julia Kilpatrick. Simon served as a colonel in the New Jersey State Militia and cut an imposing figure in his fine uniform. That martial image impressed little Judson, who decided he wanted to be a soldier when he grew up.
Judson's most earnest wish came true in 1856 when he received an appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point, New York. He graduated in 1861, ranked 17th in a class of 45. A fellow cadet recalled, quote, "His ambition was simply boundless, and from his intimates he did not disguise his faith that he would become governor of New Jersey and ultimately President of the United States."
A few days after his graduation, Kilpatrick married his sweetheart, Alice Shaler, the niece of a prominent New York politician. He carried a personal battle flag emblazoned with her name into battle for the entire war, which lasted longer than his marriage to Alice. She would die 2 years after they wed, in November 1863. Their only child died in infancy early the following year. In any case, the young lieutenant and his bride spent only one night together before he rushed off to begin his military career as a U.S. Army officer.
Recognizing that volunteer service would lead to quicker promotion than the regular Army, Kilpatrick asked his mathematics professor from West Point, Gouverneur K. Warren, to recommend him for a captaincy in the newly formed 5th New York Infantry, which Warren would command.
Kilpatrick received his commission as a captain in the 5th New York in May 1861. The next month, on June 10th, at the first sizable engagement of the Civil War, he was shot in the hip at the Battle of Big Bethel on the peninsula in Virginia and became the first U.S. Army officer to be wounded in the war. When Kilpatrick returned to duty, he did so as lieutenant colonel of the 2nd New York Cavalry. His departure from the 5th New York Infantry was not happy. Even though he recovered from his injury, he extended his absence by taking sick leave, all the while angling for higher rank in a cavalry regiment and angering Gouverneur K. Warren in the process.
Now second in command of a regiment of horsemen, Kilpatrick took part in the 1862 Peninsula Campaign as part of McClellan's Army of the Potomac. That summer, the unit left the peninsula to serve with John Pope's Army of Virginia. Kilpatrick took part in a raid on the Virginia Central Railroad and saw combat at the Second Battle of Manassas, but then his fortunes took a turn for the worse that fall.
In the fall of 1862, Judson Kilpatrick was jailed in Washington, D.C.'s Old Capitol Prison, charged with conduct unbecoming an officer. He was accused of taking bribes, stealing horses and tobacco and then selling them, and improperly borrowing money from the regiment's funds. In January 1863, string pulling by friends in high places resulted in Kilpatrick returning to his regiment without ever being tried by court-martial. For most young officers, such a scandal would have been career-ending, but amazingly, Kilpatrick not only escaped scot-free, but received a promotion to colonel and was elevated to command of the 2nd New York Cavalry.
On June 14, 1863, largely thanks to Kilpatrick's good showing at the Battle of Brandy Station 5 days earlier, Major General Alfred Pleasanton, the commander of the Cavalry Corps, had him promoted to Brigadier General.
2 weeks later, Major General Julius Stahill was relieved of command of his independent cavalry division, and the formation was merged into the Army of the Potomac. Kilpatrick assumed command of the newly designated 3rd Cavalry Division. At Gettysburg on the afternoon of July 3rd, he ordered a foolhardy mounted charge by Brigadier General Elon Farnsworth's cavalry brigade that accomplished little except the pointless death of Farnsworth.
Because of the federal victory at Gettysburg, Kilpatrick wasn't censured for his poor choice in ordering Farnsworth's brigade to charge over terrible ground. When bloody draft riots broke out in New York City a few days later, Kilpatrick went there to assume command of the Union cavalry forces moved there to assist in quelling the disturbances. Then, after visiting with his wife and newborn son for 2 weeks, he returned to duty in Virginia.
The Federal and Confederate armies spent a long and bloody fall jockeying for position. Kilpatrick suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of Jeb Stuart's rebel cavalry at the Battle of Buckland Mills on October 19, 1863. The rout, known as the Buckland Races, provided a sour ending to Kilpatrick's active campaigning season in 1863.
Judson Kilpatrick went into winter encampment searching for ways to redeem himself and restore his name to the good graces of the Army High Command and the general public, and he soon came upon an idea.
Back in the spring of 1863, while still colonel of the 2nd New York Cavalry, Kilpatrick led his regiment and the 12th Illinois Cavalry on an expedition toward Richmond during the Stoneman Raid during the Chancellorsville campaign. His force reached the outer defenses of the rebel capital before Kilpatrick withdrew, since he believed that with his small command, if he actually tried to pierce the defensive works ringing Richmond, he'd certainly be biting off more than he could chew.
Nevertheless, Kilpatrick's column came so close to Richmond and caused such a panic in the city that it prompted Abraham Lincoln to ponder the possibility of a lightning raid on the rebel capital.
Based on the information provided by a captured Confederate, indicating Richmond's defenses were only weakly held, Lincoln wrote to then Army of the Potomac Commander Joseph Hooker that he believed, quote, "There are not a sound pair of legs in Richmond. and that our men, had they known it, could have safely gone in and burned everything and brought in Jefferson Davis.
Northern newspapers trumpeted the same idea. On May 9th, the Philadelphia Evening Bulletin declared that the federal raiders, quote, might have captured Richmond, bagged the whole administration, and set the Union prisoners free, for the city was wholly undefended.
Well, Kilpatrick certainly understood the nature of the missed opportunity, and he latched onto the idea of a bold dash into Richmond to free the Union POWs at Libby Prison and Belle Isle, and in the process, win for himself unending glory.
Those federal prisoners suffered under horrific conditions. Belle Isle was a hellish place, packed beyond its capacity and offering only rudimentary shelter and sanitary facilities. There was never enough food. In January 1864, for example, the prisoners went 11 days without a single meal.
Sergeant J. Osborne Coburn, a member of the 6th Michigan Cavalry who had been captured in the fall of 1863, was a prisoner at Belle Isle. On January 18, 1864, he wrote a diary entry that succinctly describes the mental and physical condition of the POWs that awful winter. Quote, "It is 3 months since I was captured. We were full of health, heart, hope, and spirits. We were confident of our ability to endure almost anything. Now we are down, clear down, starved out. Our flesh, as well as hope and spirits, are all broken, or nearly so. We get peevish and irritable, cross, dirty, and careless, eat like beasts, our faces and hands begrimed with dirt, and but little inclination to wash them, or strength if we had." End quote. Sergeant Coburn died of chronic diarrhea on March 8th.
We discussed the conditions at Libby Prison in episode number 455 when we talked about the mass escape from that place in the second week of February 1864. Libby rivaled Belle Isle for privation and misery, and the prisoners who succeeded in making it back to Union lines recounted the horrors of their captivity, stirring up calls for action to rescue the suffering POWs.
In Richmond, a wealthy spinster named Elizabeth Van Lew ran an extremely effective Union spy ring. Van Lew regularly communicated with Major General Benjamin Butler, who commanded the Federals' Department of Virginia and North Carolina from his headquarters at Fortress Monroe at the tip of the peninsula southeast of the rebel capital. A report from a member of Van Lew's spy ring, written early in 1864, likely provided critical information that may have played a role in the Federals' decision to take action. The author of the report declared that if a strike were made upon Richmond, then one of its objectives could include, quote, the capture of Jeff Davis, which would not be a hard feat to accomplish.
The author of the report asserted that 1,000 or 2,000 Union cavalrymen could get into Richmond and, quote, burn the government buildings, release the federal prisoners, and carry off Jeff Davis. This could be effected with less risk than would appear at first glance.
That report by a spy in the Confederate capital was likely the genesis of a plan that Butler concocted both to free the POWs and also decapitate the rebel government. Butler tapped Brigadier General Isaac Wister to lead a combined arms raid on Richmond at the beginning of February 1864. Wister agreed the plan had merit. Quote, "It seemed to me that if a quick and secret concentration could be effected on the Williamsburg Peninsula, a surprise of Richmond itself by a sudden cavalry attack might be possible."
The plan called for Wister to march his infantry from Williamsburg on the night of February 5th, followed by his cavalry force the next morning. The infantry would take and hold a bridge over the Chickahominy River near Richmond. Then the horsemen would dash over the bridge into the rebel capital, surprising its defenses, and free the POWs. The Union cavalry would then withdraw with the newly liberated prisoners in tow.
However, a federal soldier, Private William Boyle, who had been condemned to death for murder, escaped from Fortress Monroe and fled up the peninsula to Confederate lines. Boyle told the rebels everything he'd heard about the upcoming raid, which effectively spoiled any possibility of surprise. As a result, although Worcester carried out the first part of the plan, advancing to the bridge over the Chickahominy, he then called off the operation once it became clear the enemy was alert to what he intended to do and had taken action to defeat his raid.
In his post-war memoirs, Worcester observed, quote, "Thus failed an enterprise prepared with care in all its details, which had engaged the liveliest interest and expectations of those to whom it was confided, and which but for an accident which none could have foreseen might have accomplished memorable results."
Despite the failure of the Worcester operation, the idea for a strike on Richmond to free the Union POWs continued to percolate, and less than 2 weeks later, Judson Kilpatrick would be in Washington, where a new plan to raid the rebel capital would be hatched.
In mid-February 1864, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton informed Major General George Meade, the commander of the Army of the Potomac, that Abraham Lincoln was very anxious to have his amnesty proclamation distributed in the Virginia countryside. And just to fix this on our timeline, but this was shortly after the failure of the Worcester expedition.
Exactly. Well, in any case, this was part of Lincoln's so-called 10% plan that we mentioned in our recent Florida episodes about the Battle of Olustee. As you guys will recall, we said that in December 1863, Lincoln had introduced his first plan for Reconstruction, or how the rebellious states would be readmitted to the Union. The proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction offered a full pardon to those individuals who took an oath of loyalty and accepted the abolition of slavery. Once 10% of a state's eligible voters did so, delegates could be elected to establish a new state constitution and form a new state government.
Stanton informed Meade that he had summoned Judson Kilpatrick to Washington to discuss the possibility of distributing the amnesty proclamation in Virginia behind enemy lines by way of a cavalry expedition.
And yes, in case you're wondering, it was highly unusual for the Secretary of War to summon Kilpatrick for a meeting outside the regular chain of command. Normally, Alfred Pleasonton, as commander of the Cavalry Corps and Kilpatrick's superior officer, would have been a part of any decision involving a part of his command. However, here, for some reason, Stanton went outside the chain of command to consult with one of Pleasonton's subordinates.
In addition, Kilpatrick met briefly with Lincoln on February 16th before Stanton sent him back to his headquarters at Stevensburg, Virginia, to develop a detailed plan for the expedition, which, beyond merely distributing the president's amnesty proclamation, would involve a lightning strike on Richmond to free the POWs at Belle Isle and Libby Prison.
The plan developed by Kilpatrick called for him to take no less than 4,000 cavalrymen and 6 pieces of artillery, cross the Rapidan River at Ely's Ford, and proceed to Spotsylvania Courthouse. Once there, he'd detach part of his column, under the command of Brigadier General George Armstrong Custer, to head off and destroy the Virginia Central Railroad Bridge near Charlottesville as a diversion.
By the way, that part of the raid resulted in Custer's surprising and clashing with the Stuart Horse Artillery Battalion outside Charlottesville, which was the subject of a recent members episode titled "Pulling the Wool Over Custer's Eyes."
Well, at any rate, while Custer was off making his diversion, the main column would cross the North Anna River and then proceed to Hanover Junction before dashing into Richmond to free the prisoners. The cavalrymen and POWs would then return to friendly lines by way of Fredericksburg. Kilpatrick pointed to recent intelligence reports suggesting that only about 3,000 militiamen, a few batteries of artillery, and a small cavalry force defended Richmond. Major General Wade Hampton's division of about 1,500 Confederate cavalrymen was the only other force available to defend the rebel capital. Kilpatrick was certain he could hit Richmond and be gone before Confederate reinforcements could be rushed to the scene.
Alfred Pleasonton raised objections to the plan. For one, significantly, it failed to address what would be done with the freed prisoners, most of whom would be sick and or malnourished and would have no means of reaching friendly lines except by walking.
Well, incredibly, no one seemed terribly concerned about that rather important consideration, and the unrealistic and terribly risky scheme was approved over Pleasonton's stated objections. In his book, The Sword of Lincoln, The Army of the Potomac, Jeffrey Wirt described the plan as, quote, myopic at the least, harebrained at the worst.
As part of Kilpatrick's plan, while he led the main column and approached Richmond from the north, 21-year-old Colonel Ulrich-Dahlgren would break off and lead a detachment of 500 troopers, making a wide swing and approach the rebel capital from the south.
Dahlgren was the youngest colonel in the Federal armies. Born near Philadelphia in April 1842, he was the second of three sons born to future Admiral John Dahlgren and his wife Mary. When his father was stationed at the Washington Naval Yard, Uli, as he was known to family and friends, received a top-notch education at the prestigious Rittenhouse Academy.
Prior to the outbreak of the war, Dahlgren lived with an uncle in Natchez, Mississippi, while studying surveying. However, in 1861, Ulrich returned to Washington and became an unofficial aide to his father. With his father, he made many visits to the War Department and the White House, making connections and building relationships and learning lessons about power, politics, and influence. He became a close friend of Lincoln's secretary, John Hay.
Ulrich's father was the inventor of the famous bottle-shaped Dahlgren gun, and through his father, the young man was no stranger to the use of artillery himself. In fact, in recognition of Ulrich's role in placing Dahlgren guns from the Washington Navy Yard on Maryland Heights at Harper's Ferry, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton not only gave him a captain's commission in the Army, but also an assignment to Major General Franz Sigel's staff. He served with Sigel in the Shenandoah Valley and then at the Second Battle of Manassas, where he functioned as the de facto artillery chief of 11th Corps.
In November 1862, he led a detachment of cavalry across the Rappahannock River in an attempt to gain information about Confederate strength at Fredericksburg. He returned safely from the patrol, which gave him a taste for danger and adventure. In February 1863, Dahlgren was appointed aide-de-camp to Joseph Hooker, the new commander of the Army of the Potomac.
Not content to rest easy at headquarters, Dahlgren accompanied Brigadier General John Buford's column in the surprise attack on Jeb Stuart's Confederate cavalry at Brandy Station on June 9, 1863. In the fighting, he narrowly escaped capture when his horse was shot out from under him. After Hooker was replaced with George Meade just prior to the Battle of Gettysburg, Dahlgren sought and received permission to take 10 troopers from newly promoted Brigadier General Wesley Merritt's cavalry brigade to scout behind enemy lines. While doing so, on July 2nd, Dahlgren and his party captured an important dispatch from Jefferson Davis advising Robert E. Lee that no reinforcements would be sent from Richmond to Lee's army in Pennsylvania.
Several days later, on July 6th, after joining up with Kilpatrick's cavalry division and always eager to pitch into the fray, Dahlgren was wounded in the right foot during a skirmish in the streets of Hagerstown, Maryland. In his official report, Kilpatrick praised Ulrich, writing, quote, Captain Dahlgren was wounded, leading a daring charge through the streets of Hagerstown.
On July 9th, Ulrich arrived in Washington and was taken to his father's home to recuperate. Uli's mother wasn't living, and his father had recently left for South Carolina to command the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron, so his Aunt Patty came from Philadelphia and took charge of nursing him. Friends visited, as did President Lincoln and Secretary of War Stanton. During one of Stanton's visits, he shared with Aunt Patty that he had promoted Ulrich to colonel.
Dahlgren was suffering and in great pain from his wound, which became infected. Gangrene set in, and on July 21st, 15 days after he was wounded, a surgeon amputated Ulrich's lower right leg below the knee.
For 3 days, his life hung in the balance, and it appeared he wouldn't survive. Finally, on the 4th day after the surgery, he showed some improvement, and then gradually got better with each passing day. He was given the news that he'd been promoted to colonel, and by August 1st, the doctors declared him out of danger.
As he got stronger, he learned to walk on crutches. By November, he felt able to make the journey to South Carolina to visit his father. During the visit, Ulrich did something for the first time since that terrible day in Hagerstown. He rode a horse.
Ulrich's visit with his father lasted until January 22, 1864, when he left to return to Washington. There, newly fitted with a wooden prosthetic leg, and although still forced to use crutches, he longed to return to duty. His wish came true when he was selected to take part in Judson Kilpatrick's upcoming raid on Richmond. The choice of the one-legged boy colonel, who had never commanded a force as large as 500 men before, surprised many. But nevertheless, on February 18th, he arrived at Kilpatrick's headquarters at Stevensburg, ready to help fine-tune the plan for the raid. And with that, with the stage set for the Kilpatrick-Dahlgren raid, we'll wait until the next episode to recount what happened on the raid itself, which led to Ulrich Dahlgren's death and the controversy stemming from the discovery of those astounding documents on his body that set off a firestorm of controversy.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation, and our recommendation this time is Like a Meteor Blazing Brightly, The Short but Controversial Life of Colonel Ulrich Dahlgren by Eric J. Wittenberg. Don't forget you can find a list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
Also at the website, you can find information on joining the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon and supporting the podcast in that way. Just like O.W., Brian L., Tony N., Jack R., Paul C., Thomas R., and Miranda have all done recently.
A big thank you to them. And thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of the podcast. Rich and I do hope that you join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.